There is a particular kind of silence that settles over the high plains in the weeks before the first frost. A silence so complete and so deliberate that a man can hear his own heartbeat knocking against his ribs like a fist against a barn door. And it is in that silence, in that vast and indifferent cathedral of wind-bent grass and iron-colored sky, that certain truths become impossible to avoid. The land out here does not care about your plans. It does not care about your debts or your pride or the promises you made to your father when you were 17 years old and still believed that wanting something hard enough was the same as earning it. The land simply persists. It endures through drought and flood and fire and the slow grinding passage of generations. And what it asks of the people who work it is not cleverness or charm or even courage, exactly, but something quieter and harder than any of those things. What it asks is for you to stay. And so it was that in the autumn of 1889, on a parcel of 460 acres sitting just east of the Cimarron River in what was not yet quite a state, a man named Caleb Dunmore rode back onto land that was no longer entirely his own, and he did it knowing full well what the woman standing on the porch of that weathered house was going to say when she saw him coming. He had been gone 11 days. Not a long time by some measures. A long time by others. Long enough, certainly, for the bank in Guthrie to have sent a second letter, and long enough for the drought, which had been building since July with the slow and patient malice of a card player holding aces, to finish what it had started with the winter wheat. He rode in just before sundown, his horse tired and his face carrying the particular blankness of a man who has spent 11 days talking himself into something and then out of it again and then, finally, reluctantly, irrevocably, into it once more. Her name was Margaret. Everyone called her Meg except for her mother, who was dead, and Caleb, who called her nothing at all most of the time, speaking to her in the half-finished sentences and long silences that passed between them for conversation, and that had, over the 4 years of their marriage, become a language as specific and as private as anything written in a book. She was standing in the doorway when he rode up, one arm crossed over her chest and the other holding a lantern that she did not need yet, the light just beginning to fail around the edges of the world, and she watched him dismount and lead the horse toward the water trough without saying anything, and he unsaddled the horse and rubbed it down without saying anything, and it was only when he finally walked toward the house and came within 10 feet of her that she spoke. She said, "The second letter came from the bank." And he said, "I know." And she said, "Mr. Aldrich came by on Thursday, said he had a buyer." And Caleb stopped walking. He stood there in the cooling dust with his hat in his hands and looked at the ground for a long moment. And then he looked up at her, and what passed between them in that look was not nothing. It was, in fact, quite a great deal. It was 4 years of early mornings and late nights, and a stillborn child in the spring of '87 and 2 lean harvests back to back, and a well that went dry in August, and the memory of a single evening, the previous October, when everything had been right with the world for approximately 3 hours, which was not much, but which had been enough to make both of them decide, in their separate and private ways, to keep going. "I went to see my uncle," Caleb said. "She didn't move. In Dodge. I know where your uncle lives. He's willing to lend the money to cover what we owe on the note, enough to get through to spring." The lantern light moved slightly as the first breath of evening wind came down from the north. "On what terms?" she said, and it was not quite a question. "He wants the deed, his name on it, as security." There was a silence that was not comfortable, but that was, in its way, honest. "So," she said, slowly, feeling the shape of it, "your uncle would hold the deed to our land until the loan is repaid. 3 years, maybe 4. She looked out past him at the horizon, at the pale orange scrape of light still clinging to the edge of the sky above the western ridge, and he looked at her looking at it, and neither of them said anything for a while. It was the particular quality of that silence that would come back to him later, in the years that followed, whenever he tried to understand what had happened between them during those months. Not what was said, but what was underneath what was said, moving like water under ice. They had not married for love. That was the honest version of it, and Caleb was, in his bones and in his habits of mind, an honest man, even when honesty cost him something. He had married Margaret Holloway in the spring of 1885 because she was the daughter of Owen Holloway, who owned the 60 acres adjacent to the southeast corner of the Dunmore parcel, and because Owen Holloway was dying of a chest ailment and had no sons, and because the 60 acres, added to the 400 he already held, would make a property large enough to run cattle on in addition to wheat, which was what you needed out here if you wanted to survive the years when one or the other failed you. He had told himself, at the time, that this was simply practical, that most marriages in this part of the country were built on practical foundations, and that love, if it came, would arrive later, the way rain sometimes came after a long, dry spell, not because anyone had earned it, but simply because the conditions had finally aligned. What he had not accounted for was the particular character of the woman herself. He had known Meg Holloway at a distance for several years before they married. She was quiet and capable, and had her father's habit of going still when she was thinking hard about something, a quality Caleb had always interpreted as placidity. He had been wrong about that. What he had mistaken for placidity was attention. She paid attention to everything with a focused and relentless precision that he found alarming once he was close enough to be the object of it. She knew, for instance, that the second horse preferred the north corner of the pasture even in summer. She knew that the Hendersons' marriage had been in trouble since February of 1887 from the way Mrs. Henderson carried her shoulders when she walked out of the post office. She knew that Caleb, in the mornings before the day got its hands around him, was a different kind of man than he was in the evenings, and she had developed, quietly and without comment, a habit of asking him the things that mattered in those early morning hours and leaving the difficult topics alone in the evenings. He had noticed this. It had taken him a while to notice it, the way a man doesn't notice the sound of a clock until it stops, but he had noticed it. And in the noticing, something had shifted. The arrangement with his uncle did not go smoothly, which surprised no one who knew anything about Caleb's uncle. The man was not cruel, exactly, but he had the habit, common in men who have spent their lives managing other people's obligations, of treating a business transaction as a kind of moral judgment, as though the fact of the debt was itself evidence of some fundamental failing in the debtor's character. He came out to the property in November to inspect it, arriving in a hired buggy with a young man from his office who wrote things down in a leather notebook, and Caleb stood beside Meg on the porch and watched them walk the fence lines and examine the well and look at the wheat fields, which were already brown and disappointing, and he was aware, in a way that he could not have articulated to anyone, that he was ashamed, not of the land. The land was what it was. He was ashamed, obscurely but powerfully, of being seen to need. His uncle sat at their table that evening and ate Meg's cooking, which was good, and drank Caleb's coffee, which was strong, and talked about the terms of the arrangement in the tone of a man explaining something obvious to someone slow, and Caleb sat across from him and listened and agreed to each term as it was stated. And through all of it, Meg sat at the far end of the table and said almost nothing. But what she said precisely. When his uncle observed that the property would have been easier to hold if it had been managed differently in the first years, she said, pleasantly, that the first years had included a drought and a flood and a child buried in the south field, and that she imagined most properties would have been easier to hold in the absence of those things. His uncle had looked at her. Caleb had looked at her. She had looked at his uncle. And the conversation had moved on. He thought about that moment for a long time afterward. They got through that winter. It was not graceful, getting through it. The money from his uncle covered the banknote and the seed for spring and not much else, and they ate carefully and repaired things with wire and ingenuity rather than money, and traded labor with the Hendersons and the Bautista family on the section to the north. And Meg took in sewing from 3 households in town, which she did at the kitchen table in the hours after supper with a lamp tilted close, and her hands moving with the automatic efficiency of long practice. He watched her do this on the evenings when he was inside, and he felt, watching her, something that did not have a simple name. It was not quite guilt, and it was not quite gratitude, and it was not quite admiration, though it contained elements of all three. It was something closer to the feeling you get standing at the edge of a piece of country you thought you knew, and suddenly realizing that it goes further than you'd imagined. Spring came, and the wheat came in better than expected, and the summer was dry, but not catastrophically so, and by the following November they had paid back a third of what was owed to his uncle, and the land felt, tentatively, like theirs again. It was around this time that Caleb began to understand that he had been conducting his marriage on a set of assumptions that were not, strictly speaking, accurate. He had assumed, without quite saying it even to himself, that Meg understood the nature of their arrangement, that she knew it had been, in the beginning, a practical alliance, that she harbored no illusions about what had drawn him to speak to her father in the spring of 1885 and what had drawn her father to receive him favorably. He had assumed she was, in some sense, at peace with this. He had been wrong about that, too. He found out in the way that a man usually finds out the things he has been most careful not to know, which is to say, accidentally and at a terrible time. It was a Tuesday evening in late October of 1890, and they had been arguing, in their fashion, about the timber lease on the North 40. He wanted to sell it. She thought it was foolish to sell a timber lease in a country where wood was scarce and getting scarcer. The argument had been going on for 3 days, quietly and persistently, surfacing at meals and at the end of the workday and in the moments before sleep. And it had not been unpleasant, exactly, because their arguments never quite were, but it had been building to something, a resolution or a rupture, and on that Tuesday evening it found its resolution in the worst possible way. He said, intending to end the discussion, that the lease was his to sell or hold as he saw fit, since his name was the one on the deed. He said it not cruelly, but definitively, in the tone of a man shutting a door. And then he watched what happened to her face. It was not dramatic. That was, in retrospect, the thing that stayed with him most clearly. Her face did not crumple or contort. She simply went still in that way she had, went very still and very interior. And then she said, quietly, "I know." And then, after a pause that lasted a long time, she said, "I know you only married me for the land." The room was very quiet. The lamp was burning low and needed trimming, and he hadn't trimmed it. Outside, the wind was doing what it did in October, which was to say, it was serious about itself. He sat with what she had said for a long moment, long enough that he had time to feel several different things in sequence, starting with the impulse to deny it and moving through something that felt uncomfortably like recognition and arriving finally at something that felt like clarity, sudden and cold and strangely clean. She had turned away from him by then, her back straight and her shoulders carrying the news of how much she had not meant to say that. He stood up from the table. He went to the small desk beside the window where they kept the papers. He opened the drawer. He was not sure, even as he was doing it, that he knew exactly what he was going to do next, which was unusual for him. He was a man who generally knew what he was going to do next. He had that quality of deliberateness that tends to develop in people who live in places where impulsive decisions have serious consequences, where you think before you cut a fence line or dig a well because the cost of being wrong is not inconvenience but catastrophe. And yet he was not thinking clearly in that moment. Or rather, he was thinking clearly, but about something larger and less concrete than his usual considerations, about what kind of man he was going to be for the rest of his life, and what kind of husband and what kind of farmer of this particular piece of ground. And the answer to all 3 of those questions seemed to converge, suddenly and with great force, on a single action. He found what he was looking for, and he took it out and he looked at it for a moment, and then he walked back to the table and set it down in front of her. It was the deed. She looked at it. She looked at him. He picked it up again and he tore it. He tore it cleanly and completely, down the middle and then again, and the pieces lay there on the table between them with the lantern light falling across them and the wind still serious outside and everything in the room suddenly very still. She said, "Caleb." He said, "Try again." She looked at him. He looked at her. "Try again," he said. "Figure out another reason." She stared at him for a long moment, and then she looked at the pieces of the deed on the table, and then she looked back at him, and her face was doing something complicated that he couldn't entirely read, which was unusual, because he had gotten better at reading it over the years, and he was fairly good at it by now. "That was the only copy," she said. "I know," he said. "The land is in both names when we file a new one." She said nothing. The wind found a gap in the siding somewhere and moved through the room for a moment and then was gone. "You tore up the deed to your land," she said. "Our land," he said. And then he went to the lamp and trimmed it, because it needed doing, and the light steadied and brightened and filled the room, and neither of them said anything more about it that night. But something had changed, and they both knew it. And knowing it together, unspoken and acknowledged, was its own kind of language. The new deed took 3 weeks to file, the county recorder being a methodical man who did not rush documents. During those 3 weeks, there was no deed to the Dunmore property. Or rather, there was one, torn into 4 pieces and sitting in the cook stove where Caleb had put it the next morning after building the fire, which Meg had watched him do without comment from her side of the kitchen. She had been making biscuits. She had continued making biscuits. He had fed the torn deed to the flames 1 piece at a time and watched it burn, and she had cut the biscuits out with the tin cutter and put them in the oven, and that was that. The new deed, when it came back from the county, had both their names on it: Margaret Elaine Dunmore and Caleb James Dunmore, joint tenants. He put it in the desk drawer, and she watched him put it there, and they went back to whatever they had been doing before. But things were different after that. Not loudly different. Not in a way that anyone watching them from the outside would have necessarily been able to identify or measure. But between them, in the specific economy of their private language, a number of things shifted. He asked her opinion about the North 40 timber lease, and she gave it, and he listened to it, and they did not sell the lease. They used the timber over the following decade to build a new barn and to trade with 3 neighboring families, and eventually to put money aside for what they were already, by the winter of 1891, cautiously beginning to think of as the children, though there were not yet any children, a matter of some ongoing and private hope between them. The first child, a girl, arrived in June of 1892. They named her Ruth, after nobody in particular, but because it was a name that felt like it had some weight to it, like it could hold a person up. What Caleb found, in the years that followed, was that the story he had told himself about why he had married Meg Holloway was a story that became progressively less useful as the years went on. Not false, exactly, in the way that simple stories are rarely entirely false, but insufficient. Like a map that has the roads right but leaves out the terrain. He had married her for the 60 acres. That was true. And she had married him because her father asked it of her and because the alternative was uncertain and the times were hard. That was also true. And both of those things had been, in their way, the foundation. But foundations are not the same as the structure that gets built on them. And over the years that followed, what got built between them on that practical and unpromising base was something considerably more complicated and more durable than either of them had planned or expected or, perhaps, entirely deserved. He came to rely on her intelligence the way you come to rely on a good tool, not with sentimentality, but with a deep and functional appreciation for what it could do that you couldn't do without it. She came to understand, or so he believed, that his silences were not a form of distance, but a form of attention, that the man who said almost nothing was frequently thinking about her, about what she needed, about how to do better at the particular and ongoing project of being her husband. They argued about money and livestock and the approach of various neighbors and the raising of their children, of whom there were eventually 4, and the arguments were almost always productive in the end, even when they were not comfortable in the middle. And over time, the arguments became a form of knowing each other that felt more intimate to Caleb than anything else they shared, which was saying something. There was a winter, 1897, when the cold came in November and did not relent until nearly April, and they were inside together more than they had ever been or would be again. And he learned during those months that she had a dry, precise sense of humor that she deployed rarely, and therefore devastatingly, and that she could read faster than anyone he had ever met, and that she had opinions about the war with Spain that were more carefully considered than those of most men he knew, and that she sang to herself sometimes in the mornings when she thought he was still outside, songs he didn't recognize, not hymns, something older than that, something that might have come from her grandmother or her grandmother's grandmother, and he would stand just inside the door and listen for a moment before going in, and those moments felt, to him, like something he had not expected and could not have named, but that he was grateful for, in a way that went beyond the vocabulary he generally used for gratitude. The land did well, in fits and starts, the way land in that country always did. Good years and bad years, and the occasional year that was simply catastrophic, and the occasional year that felt almost like grace. By 1905, the debt to his uncle was long gone, and the timber lease was gone too, traded finally to a lumber company from Kansas City for enough money to buy the 120 acres on the north side of the river that they had been watching for 15 years. And the combined property now ran to something over 600 acres, and Caleb was 44 years old and had gray in his hair and a bad knee from a horse that had fallen on him in the winter of 1898, and Meg was 41 and had lines at the corners of her eyes and hands that told the story of 20 years of weather and work, and their daughter Ruth was 13 and already showing her mother's quality of attention, and their son Thomas was 11 and already showing his father's quality of stubbornness, and the other two, James and Clara, were 9 and 7, and still largely mysterious in the way that small children are, still in the process of becoming whoever they were going to be. And on a Sunday afternoon in November of 1905, Caleb and Meg sat on the porch of the house that he had built, and that she had made into something else entirely, and they drank coffee and looked at the property that was theirs, joint tenants, which was a legal phrase that Caleb had come to feel a great deal about over the years. And she said, "I'm glad we stayed." And he said, "So am I." And that was, between them, an enormous conversation. The Henderson place had been sold 3 times since 1890 and was now owned by a corporation in Chicago, and no one named Henderson had lived in it for 9 years. The Batista family was still there, 3rd generation now on the same land, their son Miguel having married a woman from Albuquerque who was apparently formidable in ways that Meg described with a particular tone of admiration. The county had changed, and the territory had become a state, and the railroad had come through and changed the economics of everything, and there had been a year of floods and a year of grasshoppers, and a year that Caleb still referred to only as the bad year and did not elaborate on, and through all of it, they had stayed. Which was what the land asked, which was what they had given it, together, in both their names. The thing about a life built in a particular place is that the place starts to carry it. The weight of it gets distributed into the soil and the fences and the walls of the buildings, and long after the people are gone, something of what they built and endured and decided remains, not as a ghost, exactly, but as a shape, an impression, the way water leaves its mark on stone, not all at once, but slowly, over time, through persistence alone. When Ruth Dunmore, who had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness and her grandmother Holloway's exact way of tilting her head when she was thinking, took over the management of the property in 1928, she had already been working it for 15 years. And when she filed the deed in her own name, she put it in the desk drawer where she had watched her father put documents her entire childhood. And she sat at the kitchen table where she had watched her parents argue about timber leases and north pastures and the character of various neighbors. And she felt the weight of all of it in the room around her, felt it in the particular quality of the morning light coming through the window. Her mother had demanded they cut into the east wall in 1897, and she understood, in the way that people who have grown up inside a thing understand it, not theoretically but in their bodies, what it had cost, and what it had been worth. Caleb died in the winter of 1921, his bad knee finally having spread its complaint to his hip and then further in the way of old injuries. He died in the bedroom of the house he had built, with Meg beside him and all 4 of his children in the house, and he was 60 years old and had spent 32 years farming that land with the woman he had married for 60 acres, and what he felt in those last quiet hours was not regret. It was something that had no precise name in any language he knew, but that felt, insofar as he could locate it, like the particular satisfaction of a man who has done the work he was given to do. Meg lived to 1934, which meant she saw the early years of the drought that would take so much from so many people in that country, and she watched it come the way she had always watched hard things come, with that quality of stillness that was not placidity but attention, and she managed the property through the first 3 years of it with the same focused and relentless precision she had brought to everything. And she died in the spring of that year, in the same bedroom, with Ruth beside her, and outside the window the land was dry and waiting, as it had always been, for whoever was willing to stay. If you are watching this from somewhere that has land like that, flat and patient and indifferent and more beautiful than it has any right to be, You know what I mean when I say that the land asks something of you that is harder than work and more specific than love. It asks for permanence. It asks you to stake something real against the possibility of failure, to put your name on a piece of paper and mean it, and then to mean it again the next year and the year after that, through all the years that do not cooperate with your plans and the seasons that take more than they return. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from, where your particular piece of ground is, whether you stayed or left, and what that choice cost you or gave you or both at once. Because I think those of you who know this country know that it is rarely just one thing. There is a version of the story of Caleb and Margaret Dunmore that is simply about land and debt and a practical marriage that became something else. That version is true. There is another version that is about what it means to tear up the only thing that proves what you own and hand the scraps to the fire and say, "Here, try again. Find a different reason, because that reason is not enough. That reason was never enough, and we both deserve better than that reason." That version is also true. What I have come to believe, in the years I have spent with stories like this one, is that the most enduring things are rarely built on the foundations that were intended. They are built on what the people involved decided to do with the foundations that they had, which were usually imperfect and sometimes nearly impossible. And occasionally, when the light was right and the wheat came in and the children were asleep and the whole vast silence of the plains was gathered around them like something almost kind. Enough. Meg was right in 1890 that Caleb had married her for the land. And Caleb was right in 1890 that that was no longer a sufficient description of what was happening between them. And both of those things can be true at once, which is perhaps the most honest thing you can say about most marriages and most pieces of ground. That what they started as and what they became are two entirely different stories. And the second story is the one that matters. Stay with your land. Stay with your people. The staying is the story.